Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If you can all sit down, we will start this panel this afternoon. Thank you for coming. As you know, this year edition of the European Development Days focus on addressing inequalities, building a world which leaves no one behind. This is really a huge challenge. And this panel will focus in particular on fostering inclusive growth. And the idea here is to try to make a link between, let's say, the economic and finance side, economic policy, and the development policy, and how the two can work together in order to foster this inclusive growth. And we will try to see how much we can learn also from experiences, for instance, here in Europe, in order to develop our development policy in a way that it is more conducive to inclusive growth. So the panel today has gathered really very, very experienced and interesting people from very different angles. So that's, I think it's promising for a very, very rich discussion. So I will just introduce the names and where they are from. So first, Commissioner Moscovici. He's the commissioner in the European Commission in charge of economic and financial affairs and taxation. By the way, he's my boss as well. Then we have Grete Faremo. She's the Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of the United Nations Office for Project Services, but I know that she has also many other experiences, among others as a development minister in Norway. Then we have Albert Zoifak. I hope I pronounced the name more or less correctly. He is the Chief Economist for Africa in the World Bank. Then we have Rejoice Namale. She's part of the Young Leaders Program in Malawi. We have Mr. Chang Mayu. He's the Vice Chairman of the China International Development Cooperation Agency. And then Tanya Cox, she's the Director of Concord Europe. So as you can see, very diverse experiences. And the panel, as I said, will focus on inclusive growth. And the idea is clearly that inclusive growth is not something good to have, is essential and is indispensable to really get growth and get growth in a sustainable way. And this applies both in developed economies as well as in developing economies. So we will try to see what kind of policies we can put in place that bring the elements of this inclusive growth. And we in the Commission, in the economic and finance side, we like to think about this in terms of what we call pre-market, in-market, and post-market segments of the economy. And to say it very briefly, because I'm sure that the Commissioner will develop that much better than I would do, the idea is pre-market means basically endeavors and opportunities. In-market is exactly how the market works in order to ensure that it produces an inclusive growth process, and that's about labor market, product markets, financial markets, and post-market is clearly about redistribution, so about the welfare systems, taxation, and other redistribution mechanisms in terms of final consumption capacities of citizens. So we will try to develop this approach and see within these various areas what kind of policies and how they can be combined in order to deliver this inclusive growth. The panel will be as interactive as possible, meaning also you in the room. And what we will do this afternoon is, first of all, we will have an introductory speech by Commissioner Moscovici. Unfortunately, he really wanted to stay there for the panel and interact with all of you, but he cannot make it today because there are too many events going on. So he will have to leave after the introductory presentation, but I'm sure you will set the scene for the follow-up discussion. And then I will give the floor to each of the panelists, and then we will start the interactive discussion. So please, Commissioner Moscovici, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena, and ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation to this very impressive event. It's a pleasure to be here today with you and to have the opportunity to think collectively and share ideas to find innovative solutions to one of the world's and Europe's most pressing challenges, the fight against inequalities. I hope to be able to give you a European perspective on some of the key questions that will subsequently be debated, and I'm sorry not to be capable to attend the debate. The issue of inequality has highly and rightly risen to the top of the political agenda over the past years. Addressing inequalities by delivering inclusive growth is thus essential for social cohesion and for a better functioning of our economic and monetary union. I speak for those countries which chair the euro. Last week, this topic of inclusive growth was on the agenda of the Eurogroup, and I had the opportunity to discuss this with euro area finance ministers. Allow me to start with a positive message. Compared with other regions of the world, disposable income inequality is relatively low in Europe. Indeed, our tax and benefit systems are quite effective in reducing inequality. Yet, income concentration at the very top has been increasing. The top 1% has gained a lot and probably gained too much in the last period. And our citizens are highly sensitive to what many perceive as excessive differences in income and wealth within their countries, as a recent Eurobarometer shows it. Indeed, the crisis period was difficult, tough for virtually everyone, although poor households were affected disproportionately more. What is, however, troublesome is that growth may have failed to be sufficiently inclusive in the recent years. Let me, to prove that, to demonstrate that, give you some figures. Between 2005 and 2015, the bottom 20% of households has seen its income decrease by around 5%. Two-thirds of this decline took place during the first half of this period, which included, as you know, the peak of the crisis. But incomes continued decreasing even between 2010 and 2015, as we entered in a period of recovery. Middle and high-income groups also suffered drops, albeit lower in their income between 2005 and 10, some 1%. But in contrast, they managed to recuperate them later. During the recovery years of 2010 to 2015, the middle and high-income households experienced income growth rates of more than 2%. In short, we need to make sure that living standards of all our citizens are improved in a sustainable way by ensuring that the benefits of economic growth are widely and properly shared and not just captured by the happy few, the very few happy few. Addressing inequality is not only a political slogan or a social issue. There is also a strong economic case for tackling inequality. As numerous studies show it, reducing inequality goes hand in hand with a stronger potential growth and more sustainable public finances. Entrenched inequality may lead to under-investment in human capital, especially for the least well-off, reducing potential growth and further reinforcing inequality itself of incomes and opportunity. So failure to deliver inclusive growth also increases the difficulty of building a political consensus about the so-called structural reforms, which appear now to be more a punishment than a perspective, once again reducing potential growth. That's where we are. Economic growth remains our guiding objective to increase living standards. However, such growth needs to be meeting three fundamental criteria. It needs to be inclusive, it needs to be fair, and it needs to be sustainable. What do I mean by this? Because you could think that those three concepts are very close one to another. First, we do not live in a world of economic models with so-called representative agents. Living standards have to increase for all and not only for some fictitious average person or average households. This is not the right way to approach statistics. Growth needs to be inclusive for all, and its fruits need to be widely shared across the population. The second fundamental attribute of growth is that it needs to be fair. It needs to enable society to deliver upon the promise of equality, of opportunity and merit-based social mobility. We should make sure that the social background and the region or even the neighborhood where a person comes from does not predetermine his or her educational attainment and after that lifetime income. Such equality of opportunity is a fundamental principle of our societies and it must be maintained. The third and equally important aspect is sustainability. We have to make sure that higher living standards today are sustainable over the longer time horizon, and this means we should stop being overly short-termist. Rather than counting the apples that we have in our pocket, we should make sure that our apple tree is healthy and produces rich harvest year after year. So how to make sure that growth fulfills these three attributes? Achieving the goals of strong and at the same time inclusive, fair, sustainable growth requires, in my view, a holistic approach to reform, intervening at the pre-market, in-market and post-market stages that Elena properly described. In terms of pre-market reforms, well-designed education and vocational training systems are key, as well as high-quality public administration and healthcare. These are essential to ensure equality of opportunity, no matter the background of individuals. Within the framework of the so-called European semester and recommendations by country that I was presenting a few days ago, the European Commission supports member states in their efforts to direct investment towards sectors that can support long-term growth. And investment in human resources and the capacity to address and meet modern challenges and workforce requirements is absolutely key. I believe that these objectives must remain a priority for all policymakers and that this method is starting to bear fruits in Europe, even if it's too slowly in these post-crisis years. In terms now of in-market reforms, we need to make sure that we make good on the promise of open and contestable product markets, efficient credit markets, as well as inclusive and adaptive labor markets. If we combine that with high-quality institutions, well-functioning markets, increase the returns on effort and on innovation, stronger incentives to accumulate human on the one hand and physical capital on the other hand tend to translate into higher potential growth, and we certainly must try to achieve this. It goes without saying that the post-market stage also continues to play a crucial role. We call it redistribution, in other words. Progressive tax and benefit systems are essential to protect individuals for income losses and to ensure also solidarity. Indeed, tax policies are there the core of such a holistic approach, and taxation is also about securing funds for education, for healthcare, and however, tax fraud, tax evasion and tax avoidance, we know, limit the capacity to do that, and they must absolutely be combated. We've started that in the recent years, as well at the international level and the European level. To address this issue is a challenge and a demand that Europe is not and cannot face alone. Populations across the globe have begun to ardently demand that all pay their fair share, that all are held accountable, and that governments tackle these issues in a meaningful way. We've built international standards, we must now reinforce it. I'm therefore quite proud, I must say, that the European Commission has achieved during this mandate a huge progress in the fight against tax fraud and evasion. Since 2014, we have succeeded in having 14 proposals adopted by finance ministers, despite we have to take unanimous decisions on those matters. We have also engaged in a dialogue with countries all around the world. I was discussing that with the chair of Oxfam this morning. And we are pushing towards more transparency and cooperation. Obviously, the fight is not over, and we are going to lead it as well at the European and international levels in the years to come. Inclusive growth is thus at the core of our EU policies, both in terms of EU budgetary instruments as well as in terms of policy advice to member states in the context of what we call the European semester, which is a budget surveillance and budget advice process. Recently, country-specific recommendations cover all three stages to deliver inclusive growth, ranging from education, from training, to market functioning, from the quality of institutions to tax and benefits system. Moreover, we will be discussing at the Council or heads of state and government level the proposed multi-annual financial framework. Let's call it our EU budget in formal form. And this will provide a number of instruments to support national reform efforts and investments, in particular the cohesion policy funds and the European Social Fund. To be maybe a little less tactful, we are working to put our money where our mouth is. Last but not least, the convergence and stability of the Eurozone that finance ministers agreed last week after several months of discussions are leading to the creation of a budgetary instrument. Let's be clear, this is not sufficient. We need to be much more ambitious and to have a true and complete Eurozone budget which is capable to address the issue of convergence and reducing inequalities and stabilization inside the EU. I'm extremely pleased that the topic of inequality is not only high on the European agenda, but is also receiving more and more attention in other international fora, and this is precisely what our discussion is about. For example, the G7 French presidency focuses on pushing forward the inequality agenda, building on agreed outcomes from the 2017, it was Italy, and 2018, it was Canada presidencies. And this year's work under the finance track focuses on sharing analysis and policy best practices with a stronger emphasis on inequalities and opportunities. The ambition of the French presidency, which we fully share, is to come up with an action plan on inequality for the G7 summit in August, also in France. I also welcome the suggestions of the presidency to set out examples of country-led reform that have produced positive effects. I also think that our cooperation with and within the G7 can support some policies that will help reduce inequality, such as policy related to international tax avoidance and evasion, and I will have a special word on digital taxes. This is an area on which we are making slow progress, and I hope that in 2020 we will be capable of building the framework that will authorize to tax the tech giants, the internet giants, where they create profits and value. This is a question of level playing field, this is a question of ethics, it's a question of reducing inequality, it's also a question of efficiency. These examples show how European and national level action can reinforce each other to address the valid concerns of our citizens, and I believe that it is the right path to follow. It is also the only way for us to show solidarity towards the rest of the world, and that's why it's so relevant to link finance and development on inclusive growth, as this roundtable will do now. I hope that my message, which is just some few introductory remarks, can offer a picture of where we are here in Brussels, Brussels being the capital of Europe, or one of the capitals of Europe, because the European Parliament is sitting somewhere else, in Strasbourg. I think, personally, that it is essential to address inequality and how we in the EU are working practically to achieve results. The last Commission was about getting out of the crisis. The next Commission must be about fighting climate change and tackling with inequality. And as such, I hope I can give you here today some food for thought in support of this upcoming debate and continuing work in the future that we will do worldwide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Moscovici. Thanks for this introduction and framing the discussion. I think that I keep a number of things that were said here that I think will be useful for the follow-up discussion. You said that living standards have to increase for all. I think that applies across the globe and is something that should guide policies. And I think that clearly the introduction showed that this challenge of inequalities and inclusive growth is very well anchored in the finance world and in the economic policy world, which I must say was not the case some years ago. So I think that only this, it's already some progress. Now it's a matter of implementing it. And we have seen that Europe can be, in a way, an example for some policies, but clearly, if we only look at the outcome of the recent elections, we see that European citizens have told us something. Something means that we are not yet there. And the Commissioner also pointed to a number of things that remain to be done, and I guess many others, in order to really reach this point of living standards have to increase for all. So now we will turn to the panel members. And basically, in the first part of your introductions, I would say you can take around 5 minutes for one more or less same question to all of you, which would be around how do you feel about this notion of integrated strategy and what kind of policies you would point to, saying, okay, this is really from my perspective, from where you are, that's the most relevant, or here is where we are putting our efforts today for this and this reason. So that's what I would like to hear in this first round, and whether you see this approach of, that the Commissioner explained, the pre-market, in-market, and post-market as something like an integrated strategy for inclusive growth. Now, we will start with Mrs. Faremo. As I already said, she's Executive Director of UNOPS, and the mission of UNOPS is to help people to build better lives and countries achieve peace and sustainable development. So I think that you have a lot to tell us. Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join this panel. I'm really happy to be here today, and the question is really, what is UNOPS's approach to fighting inequalities? And bearing in mind that UNOPS is a unique organization in the UN family, only focusing on implementation. We don't have a policy mandate. I could say we're unique also because we're headquartered in Copenhagen. This will be an intervention regarding how we think implementation in how to address inequalities. I would put it in a perspective of gender, as well as our work in fragile, vulnerable, and conflicting situations. So we can partner with governments, we can partner with international finance organizations, NGOs, we partner with the rest of the UN family, as well as the private sector. As long as our partners commit to the UN values of inclusion and inclusive growth, and promoting, for instance, gender equality, this is what matters. This will enhance our contributions to the Agenda 2030. Our mandate is in infrastructure. Infrastructure, look at our European economies, was key to the national growth over decades. It created a lot of jobs, local growth, opportunities. Actually, that is pretty much the concept we also apply in UNOPS, since infrastructure is part of our mandate. So we always think, how can we promote equal opportunities for local jobs? We provided 5 million paid local workdays last year. We report this, and we also count how many were delivered by women. And actually, close to 50% was paid work days for women. I think this is really important. Job is key to inclusion. Jobs are key to not be left behind. So in our infrastructure work, we have adopted these gender mainstreaming strategy, and we've also adopted a gender parity strategy in our own organization to be able to think what it takes to build inclusive quality infrastructure. We need to have an organization that is also guided by and governed by parity strategies. This is really important. Infrastructure is at the core of what individuals need to actually realize their potential. It's at the core of what makes a society tick. And if the infrastructure is not there, how can you actually promote local growth? So everything is linked to how we think inclusion into our infrastructure work. And wrong, if we do this wrongly, it can last for decades. So it needs to be quality infrastructure in the first place. The example I want to mention before I close is, for instance, in Gambia, repairing rural roads. We hired 400 people. Of those, 200 people were women. Quite unusual in Gambia. It set a role model. It provided inclusion, opportunities also to women. In Pakistan, it was different, because there women were actually afraid of going to jobs in a number of areas. So we provided the local infrastructure of buses for women only to actually help them access their workplace safely. So this is what UNOPS is about. It's about the practical solutions needed to actually put the policies in action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very, very clear. I take this point that you mentioned. Jobs is the first and probably the most important step to inclusiveness and inclusive growth, and in particular with this gender approach. Now let's turn to the World Bank approach to inclusive growth. Mr. Zoifag, you are the Chief Economist for Africa. So I would say, can we learn something from European experience, or we have to look at it completely different?
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it's a great privilege for me to address you in this forum. The first thing I would like to say is, at the World Bank, we take inclusive growth extremely seriously. We take inequality extremely seriously. We have our twin goals, the first being to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030, but the second goal is about boosting shared prosperity. And boosting shared prosperity is about making sure we monitor and provide the impetus for growth of the bottom 40% of the distribution to grow as fast, if not faster than the top of the distribution. So it's extremely important for us at the World Bank. The second thing I would like to say is that from an African perspective, when we discuss inclusive growth, we should not forget to discuss growth. Because currently in sub-Saharan Africa, growth is still very, very sluggish. We were growing at above 5% until 2016, until 2010, but by 2016, our growth had collapsed to 1.3%. For 2019, we are only projecting that sub-Saharan Africa would grow by 2.8%, which is just slightly above population growth. So we need to keep the focus on the growth agenda before, as we discuss inclusive growth. So growth is extremely important in the context of Africa. And it is also the case that inequality per se is a real concern. Growth alone is not enough. Africa today has 8 of the highest inequalities in the world measured by the Gini coefficient. 8 of the 10 most unequal countries are in Africa. And those countries are essentially in Southern Africa, which also raise the question of the type of, the heterogeneity of the subcontinent. There is not a single Africa. So when we discuss Africa, we need to be aware that averages or aggregate variables can be extremely misleading. Mm-hmm. So we have a handful of African countries that are driving that inequality, and that's the same for growth, by the way. So it is important to analyze inequality through different lenses, and that's where we are clearly in agreement with the approach taken in this forum to look at inequality from the opportunity side. A second very important aspect is jobs, and I think the previous speaker has mentioned jobs. The third very important aspect we also take into account in the World Bank is policies. And this is basically fiscal policies and social inclusion policies. So when it comes to inequality of opportunity, I think one thing that is extremely important from our perspective at the World Bank is to focus on inequality, inequality of access to intangible assets such as education and health. And that's why the new strategy of the Africa region is focusing on human capital improvements. The second aspect of inequality of opportunity is access to tangible assets, capital and productive assets. And one of the aspects is actually land in Southern Africa. So it is important to focus on those areas. On the job side, I think the previous speaker mentioned jobs from infrastructure, but we also need to be discussing diversification of our economies. What we have learned from our analytical work at the World Bank is that what really drives inequality down is the creation of jobs at the bottom of the distribution. Inequality declines when we have an increase in income from labor at the bottom of the distribution. That's what happened in Brazil. And Brazil, as you probably know, was one of the most unequal countries in the world, but they have dramatically reduced inequality to the point that from a Gini coefficient of 59 in 1999, Brazil is today at 52. But what happened is clearly a combination of access to the poor, to the labor market, access to jobs, but also a combination with social policies such as Bolsa Familia. Now, if we think of fiscal policies as a way to address inequality, which is something we do at the World Bank, there are two aspects to it, which is one, distribution, ensuring that growth is actually, that the benefit of growth are equally distributed across the population. But there is one aspect that I would like to highlight, which is fiscal incentives. We do tend to separate the point on fiscal incentive from inequality, but it's actually very, very important. Whom we give fiscal incentive to can actually exacerbate the distribution of income in the country. So fiscal policy should also be thought in terms of how do we make fiscal incentive, how do we make sure that firms like Commissioner Moscovici was talking about, that the firms that needs to pay taxes do their share, their fair share to the society. Now, let me close by highlighting 4 important aspects that we believe should be part of the discussion on reducing inequalities. The first is that we need to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty. The problem in Africa is that poverty is transmitted from one generation to another. And from our analytical work, the best way to break that cycle is through education. So again, it's important to invest in human capital. The second thing we believe would be critical to address the issue of inequality in Africa is connectivity. And what do we mean by connectivity? Is physical connectivity that the previous speaker talked about, but it's also about digital connectivity. Because connectivity can allow people to access markets, and it is important to also focus on that digital connectivity because it's going to be able to improve productivity of the people at the bottom of the distribution. Third is making institutions inclusive. I would want to come back to this during the discussion to elaborate. And the fourth important aspect is data and statistics. When we discuss inclusive growth in Africa, I often ask myself what we're talking about. Because the number of African countries where we actually do systematic collection of household income and consumption data, it's not large enough. It's been increasing in the past couple of months, past couple of years, but we still have a lot of work to do. So let me stop here, and I'll be happy to elaborate in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to press you a little bit, but it's true that the time is running. We have a clock there, and so I would like to have time also for the participants maybe to ask questions. Now, let me turn with, we stay in Africa, but with a very different perspective. Mrs. Namale, you are actively involved in a number of projects to improve the learning, the employability, the general living conditions of young people and women in particular. And it would be very interesting to hear from you, where do you see the potential and also what kind of barriers where the policies should address in order to get that objective?
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Rejoice Eve Namale, and I am from Malawi. I am the founder of Youth Arise Network, which exists to stimulate young minds through the promotion of entrepreneurship, volunteerism, and education to aid the eradication of poverty. I've been selected as the European Development Days Young Leader 2019, which is why I am seated with these amazing panelists. To answer your question, I definitely agree with the integrated strategy for shared prosperity. In the spirit of advancing one of the 5 major priorities of the consensus on development in Europe, prosperity, and it is also a theme that is emphasized in the African Union 2063 agenda, it should be emphasized that prosperity for all requires inclusion of all. So for me, I desire that youth voices be heard at all decision-making platforms. Now, I will put much emphasis on pre-market conditions because honestly, the initiation of any policy, the initiation of any activity, the initiation of any intervention determines the outcome. Therefore, if pre-market conditions are responsive, they are fair, they're inclusive of all groups, including youth, then it will translate into a post-market which is more responsive and equal opportunity where everybody wins. So yes, I definitely agree with the shared prosperity strategy.
Thank you very much. We will come back to some of the issues you mentioned because I think it will be interesting to hear a bit more about this being inclusive and being heard and how we can make that happen. Now, let me turn to Mr. let me see that I get the name right, Mr. Zhang Mayu, the Vice Chairman of the China International Development Cooperation Agency. We are glad to have you here because I think it's really the first time we have this opportunity, and it's very important to have the views of a very important partner in this development policy, increasingly important. I will invite all of you to put the earphones because he will speak in Mandarin. So again, the same question. What is your agency approach to this inclusive growth in the development policy?
Thank you, Chair. Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm very happy to participate in the forum hosted by the EDD. The EU is a very important participant in global development and has been a major contributor to global development and cooperation. I would like to thank the EU for inviting me here today so that I have this unique opportunity to exchange my ideas with all of you sitting here. Currently, when we look at global development, it is imbalanced and uneven. There's a great amount of inequality. To realize the goals, the SDG goals 2030, means that we need to step up our efforts. At the same time, we've been witnessing the rise of protectionism and unilateralism, which has cast a shadow on global cooperation. The theme of EDD this year is to address inequalities, building a world which leaves no one behind. And the theme of today's forum is fostering inclusive growth. Against the current backdrop, discussing these two themes are of paramount importance. I represent the Chinese government responsible for international cooperation. I'm also approaching this issue from the perspective of providing aid to developing nations. I would like to share with you three ideas. First of all, the hard input from the international community to assist developing nations. What do I mean by hard input? This is assisting the developing nations, in particular the least developed nations, the landlocked developing nations, and the small island developing nations. They require our assistance. We need to input quantities of aid in terms of infrastructure, public infrastructure, agriculture, education, public health, in an effort to improve their livelihood. Currently, when we look at the channels with which developing nations receive aid include government development aid from international organizations and international financial organizations, as well as under the South-South cooperation framework, receiving aid from other developing nations. China would like to call upon developed nations to step up your efforts in providing aid to the developing nations to reach a goal of 0.7% of the GNI. With the UN as the core of international organizations, we can express our strength to fortify information exchange and through various channels to assist the developing nations, particularly through the framework of South-South cooperation. China, as the largest developing nation in the world, under the South-South cooperation framework, has extended help to more than 160 developing nations. For us, infrastructural development and public infrastructure are of paramount importance, and we believe it is the backbone of economic growth for other developing nations. Through aid, we have managed to realize more than 3,000 roads, rail, electricity, and bridges, these types of infrastructural projects. We believe it is important to work together to build schools, build hospitals, and other public facilities in order to improve the livelihoods of people in the developing nations. So through aid, we can foster development and help the vulnerable citizens, including children and the elderly. Furthermore, we believe that the international community also needs to provide soft input. The development of a nation means that each and every nation needs to be independent. So receiving international aid is not the be-all and the end-all. We believe it is important to consider the individual characteristics of every nation and to help them train skilled people and to express their own strengths in order to fortify trade and set a very important foundation of development. We also believe in respecting the individualities of the different nations. So China would never use aid to interfere in the domestic policies of other countries or to export our own ideologies. China attaches great importance to assisting the countries that receive aid to independently develop their strengths. Through the Aid for Trade program, we have helped many nations. We have helped to train more than 300,000 people through our programs, including experts, administrators, and technical personnel. Thirdly, the international community should construct a partnership with other countries to help developing nations. As we do not have that much time, I will not go into too many details. It is our hope that through the exchange between China and the EU today, we can further deepen our exchange and to contribute to the development of international.
Thank you very much. You can see that your presentation has been very well received already, and it's really good that we can engage into exchanges and cooperation with other parts of the world. That's more than needed. So now, finally, let me turn to Mrs. Cox. She's Director of Concord Europe, the European Confederation of Relief and Development NGOs. So I think you have really a broad experience that you come here with all these organizations that you represent. And please share with us, how do you see the best kind of policy combinations for inclusive growth?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to start with two questions. The first is, why is it, given all the effort that has been put into creating growth around the world, we are seeing that growth slow down, especially in more advanced economies? I mean, we see that politicians have staked their careers practically on creating growth, and yet it's getting harder and harder to actually deliver on. Why is this? The second question I would like to ask is, why is it that we believe that we can grow indefinitely when we're living on a finite planet? I could quote Kenneth Boulding, who said that anyone who thinks that growth can go on forever on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. Now, Kenneth Balding was an economist himself, so I think that gave him the right to say that. But I do think we need to ask ourselves these questions. The Earth is a closed system, not an open market. If we look at what happens with GDP growth, and we look about what we're trying to actually achieve, actually sometimes GDP growth works in the opposite direction of what we're trying to achieve. For example, key to us in Concord is making sure that everybody has a sense of well-being. So the well-being of people and planet are absolutely crucial. GDP goes up when there's a war. But obviously a war isn't any good for well-being. GDP goes up when there's an oil spill. But that is clearly absolutely catastrophic for marine ecosystems. So we can see that GDP is not a good measure of well-being. It has nothing to do with well-being, and it was actually never designed to be a measure of well-being. And this was pointed out back in the 60s by Robert Kennedy. What's more, in actual fact, the benefits of growth, as we've called it, don't trickle down to the furthest behind. They stop after a certain point. So the growth may or may not continue, but they don't actually reach the furthest behind. So the furthest behind get left even further behind. So this trickle-down effect, as it's been called, would seem to depend on a lot of other things. It depends on, for example, the savings rate in the economy. It depends on, for example, the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. So government policies are absolutely critical to deciding who's going to benefit from any progress we may make in an economy. What I would most particularly like to reinforce, perhaps in these opening remarks, is the fact that growth as we're pursuing it today has led to a plundering of the planet, it has led to soaring inequalities, and we're seeing now that it has led to social tension, social unrest. There are people coming out on the streets to protest against the climate change that we're seeing, which is one of the effects of economic growth as we've pursued it to date, but also against the social inequalities that have been built into our societies. So the neoliberal model of privatization, free markets, small role for the state, low taxation for the highest earners, it's not working. It's not working for the masses. And in actual fact, we've all been talking on the panel, or a lot of the panelists have been talking about jobs as being absolutely crucial. Of course, Concord also believes that. But it's the workers who have borne the brunt, who have borne the costs of the neoliberal policies that we've been following to date. So what we're calling for in Concord is a complete rethink, a restructuring of the economy so that we put the well-being of people and planet first, and we actually follow policies that will lead us there. Maybe I'll leave it there for the time being.
Thank you very much. Well, we have the full program. Now we have to try to see how we can put it in place with the participation of everybody here and everybody else that it is active in this field. Let me point to a number of issues or questions that I think are a little bit cross-cutting from what you said. Not necessarily that you are in agreement, but that you mentioned those things. Jobs, the two of you mentioned jobs. You say yes, but. Then growth. You mentioned first growth and then inclusive growth. I seem to hear from other participants that growth, inclusive and sustainable growth go together. And today we cannot go with one first, the other second, and the other third. But it is a matter also for discussion. But I think this notion of inclusive, sustainable, it seems to me it's also linked to institutions in the countries, institutions in the broad sense. How do they work? And how do they work to make sure that what is going on is what the people there want? And I think I heard also our Chinese colleague to mention that about not interfering with what the people in the place want to do with their growth or their development. And also what you mentioned here about inclusive in terms of being involved.
Yes.
Being involved in the policy making, in the definition of policies. So what we get out of all this, let's see. But those points I think would be interesting to come back to that. I will give the floor back to you for a very short intervention before opening for questions or comments.
Sure.
So if you want to develop a bit this notion of jobs and how these jobs can lead to inclusive growth.
Yeah, I think it's evident to all of us that how we're able to fight climate change and how we're able to secure inclusion is very important. It's highly political, and it has to do with many things that are decided at national, international, and local level. So for UNOPS, it's really to find a way to use the space of working under our mandate to help out, for instance, in crisis. Very often we see crisis may be enhanced, even caused, by lack of jobs and hopes. So how do you build sustainable jobs in such an environment? The worst thing you can do is not doing anything. So how we are able to partner to secure inclusion and to secure a future that brings hope is very important at what we do in crisis, not interfering with politics, but actually helping politics through actions on the ground. And for the long term, of course, how you are able to mobilize resources in fragile economies. There are now in a situation where the risk of being left even further behind will require new actions. So how we are able to facilitate interaction between governments, public spending, and private, and how we're able to introduce, for instance, transparent public procurement, because procurement is part of our mandate, is key. When we are able to help governments save millions of dollars in their public procurement that can be reallocated into new services for citizens, we feel worthwhile. We do something that matters to the citizens on the ground. And when we help newborn babies and mothers to access health services, this is also important. So how we are able to drive the social, environmental, and financial implications of what we do in a positive direction matter. And I think realizing the value of women in the workforce is probably also one of the single most important parts that can drive this kind of inclusive growth. But there is no right or wrong, but how we move together in the right direction, securing also a voice for those that don't have a voice today is really important. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So maybe I invite you now to maybe comment more on this notion about first growth and inclusive growth, because it seems to me that at least I would have a couple of examples in Africa where countries have quite a good growth in terms of GDP numbers, but because institutions didn't work, because that was also related to corruption, and because it was not inclusive, they end up by much lower GDP growth after a number of years.
Very, very good. I think the point to make here is that it's difficult to be inclusive when there is no growth.
Yeah.
So we need to really keep the growth focus in countries where growth is extremely low or very sluggish. That's the first point. The second is we need to be working in parallel while pushing the growth agenda in sub-Saharan Africa. We have to, at the same time, be working to ensure inclusive growth, but we also have to focus on sustainability. Let me just give you one example of activity the World Bank is actually involved that could actually do all of this at the same time and is actually doing so. It's our support to investment in climate resilient infrastructure. And investment in climate resilient infrastructure is what, for example, has allowed a city like Beira in Mozambique during the latest cyclone to actually save some of its activities. And by investing in climate resilient infrastructure, we are achieving the jobs agenda by using the local force. We are certainly emphasizing the sustainability and the climate change angle, but we are also ensuring growth. I think it's not either or, we need to work on these three areas. Another area where the World Bank is involved and that could actually ensure sustained and inclusive growth is the area of the digital economy. We are supporting the African Union's push for a moonshot when it comes to the digital revolution by investing in digital infrastructure, by closing the gap of access to broadband. For example, we are working with African countries to invest in digital skills, especially for women. We are working with countries to invest in digital platforms to ensure the better functioning of civil services and to fight corruption, for example. And these are all very, very important, but we're also reforming the regulatory framework that would ensure more competition within economies and allow the all levels of the population to benefit from those fruits of growth. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe you can, Mrs. Nemale, you can jump into that that specific policy, the digital and the connectivity and all this, maybe from the point of view of where you are with the young people and entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs, etc. Do you think this is key, or where would you put the priorities?
Okay, in my opinion, I believe that relevant policies should be made for specific countries. Now, for Malawi, in impoverished communities, digital access is not that well advanced. We don't have that much access to digital skills, or there's no much relevance in that specific community. But then we need to go into these rural communities and ask them what aspects of entrepreneurship skills would you desire? What works in your community? What products would serve your community best? So before we fix the problem, let us now go to the core and find out the root cause of the problem. That's what I believe.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very, very clear. So let's first ask before coming with big projects. Let's first ask what people want. That's a very clear message. Now, if I may turn to you, in your experience with your cooperation agency, you mentioned also that point that it's very important not to interfere and to listen what the communities want. How would you do that, or how do you do that actually in your policy?
Thank you, Elena. Well, actually, you asked a very good question. And China's foreign aid actually is conducted without any political preconditions. So our aid is provided based on the needs of recipient countries. So we will provide a recommendation based on their conditions so that they can decide what projects to be done. For example, what infrastructure is needed and what personnel is needed, what materials they will need. So actually, I would like to respond to your remarks about the job creation. So in order to create jobs, on the one hand, we actually are engaged in a large amount of personnel training. And we think knowledge and expertise is very important to get the job. Secondly, When we provide aid to developing countries, such as building houses, bridges, and the railway, we try our best to hire local people and use local materials. So in the post-project operations, we also try our best to leave it for recipient countries to do everything so that they can reduce reliance and become independent. Thank you.
So that goes into the direction of sustainability in a way, because we want to do things that will stay and that will allow the communities to become more resilient and more able to do it by themselves in the longer term. Now, Mrs. Cox, you mentioned at the very end that we need to rethink basically everything. So we will not have time to do that right now, but I would like to ask you maybe a couple of ideas to trigger that thinking about how you would see it.
Sure. First of all, we need to decide what are we actually trying to do, whether we're talking about growth or whether, in our case, we're talking about progress. We want to make progress for all people. We're all in agreement on that. We want it to be inclusive. We want to create well-being for people and the planet. That's the first thing that, for me, is a premise. That means that chasing after one figure, called GDP or gross domestic product, could actually be a distraction. It could be misleading us. I completely agree that developing countries need to invest in infrastructure, they need to invest in energy, they need to invest in healthcare, in education, absolutely. But this may indeed create an increase in their material demand. But it doesn't necessarily mean we're chasing a growth-based agenda, and that's the difference. It's how are we structuring our policies in terms of what we want to achieve. One of the things that we would argue is that if we really want to make workers have good jobs, decent jobs, we want to create enough jobs for people, then we need to actually prioritize the rights of workers. And to date, what we've seen is the prioritization of the owners of capital. Their interests have been prioritized until now, and this is one of the things that we would like to see changed. And here we definitely need a role for the government. Governments need to be empowered to be able to do this. Traditional tools to tackle inequality, for example, fiscal measures, they're not actually enough anymore. Inequality has got so bad that we need to use other measures as well. And one of these would be to look at how companies are structured so that they actually benefit the workers. Another example that we would put forward is democratizing the workplace so that the workers can actually contribute to the decisions that are taken within their companies. And there are many examples where this is contributing to quite some success. For example, cooperatives. The other thing that could be considered, if you want concrete examples, would be actually to look at corporate governance. Change the purpose of the companies. Allow them to look long term. I believe it was the Commissioner who mentioned this. We need to look longer term, not just at the next quarter's results. Allow this through the company's constitution. Allow this through the national legislation. Enable companies to work in the interest of all their stakeholders and not just their shareholders. That would be another key change that we would propose.
Thank you very much. Already clear ideas about how to go, where to go. Now we have like 5 minutes maybe, or maybe 10, I don't know. I look at the organizers. Please, now the floor is open. Raise your hand if you have a question or anything you would like to say here for the benefit of everybody, and questions to the panelists. Be very short, please, but we have some time. So who would like to go first? I'm sure you have also your own experiences that can be very useful, and I'm sure that you don't agree with everything that has been said. So, yeah, here. I don't know, there is a micro? Yes, it's coming.
Well, I have a comment, which is that I'm both an economist and a bit of a madman, apparently, because I still think that the material size of the pie, I mean, has to increase in the developing countries. I mean, to make progress and to get a better living for people there. So that's just a side comment. My question actually would be for Mr. Zeufach, and here, I mean, on the role of in-market policies, and in particular the role of financial markets, I mean, to foster inclusive growth. I mean, what role or or what barriers do you see in the financial markets?
Thank you very much. Somebody else in the room? I don't see any hand yet. Take your chance. Yes, over there.
Hello, yes, I'd just like to put a question to the Chinese representative on the panel. Maybe to ask a question, I know that the provision of infrastructure is a very important part of international development and so on, but very often it can leave the host country or the country which is benefiting from the infrastructure with very large debt burden. And just to say that probably one of the most pernicious aspects of the growth model has been the growth of debt and the kind of debt burdens that many countries around the world are saddled with, and then the interest payments which continue to use up a lot of public revenue that could be used otherwise for public services and so on. So, you know, in terms of a development model, is there anything that the speaker could suggest that might avoid that debt trap where we leave developing countries with, yes, great infrastructure, but you know, significant debt that they have to continue to pay off over many years? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the question. Two more, and then we close the time for questions. Anybody else? Yes, here.
Thank you. I have a question for the representative of the World Bank. I would like to ask you whether you don't find risky to link the inclusive approach to economic growth. Wouldn't this provide an alibi not to promote an inclusive agenda in other situations? Thanks.
Thank you. And the last one, here in front.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm coming from the World Trade Organization, and my question is for Mr. Maoyu Zhang. Was delighted to hear of China's work with least developed countries, and I'm interested if he could cite a couple of examples of working with LDCs on trade for development aspects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I turn the floor first to Mr. Zhang. You got 2 questions.
Thank you for your questions. So I would like to start with the second question. It is about how China support the developing countries in terms of trade. In recent years, China has attached the importance to autonomous capability in building up themselves for the developing countries. And we actually adopt the kind of consultation approach and help them to map out the plan and the trade policy. We are active in responding to initiatives proposed by the WTO and focus on the providing aid to productive projects and giving a kind of zero tariff in order to be also engaged in multilateral trade system. And all this actually is designed to promote the recipient countries to build up their trade system, lower cost of transaction and the cost of cooperation, and in the end to create more jobs. At the same time, we also try our best to help them to increase their capability to be engaged in the global value chain. So that is my response to your question about the trade and the development. So at the another question, it's about the debt. Well, we actually, our foreign aid actually include the grants, interest-free loans, and the concessional loans, etc. In recent years, based on some kind of media coverage, you may learn that China's foreign aid actually has led to that problem. Well, I think that issue is very complex. Some is related to their structure. Some is related to the cumulative kind of or problem legacy of those developing countries. And some also related to international global context. For example, recently you can see the emerging protectionism, and also kind of the problem with the main reserve currencies. So all this actually has led to the kind of that issue. When we cooperate with our partners, and especially if you look at those developing countries receiving China's foreign aid, no country actually falls into a debt trap because of cooperating with China. Furthermore, in order to solve the debt problem faced by developing countries, the Chinese government actually has announced several times the measures to exempt them from debt. In order to help developing countries to resolve their trade imbalance, we take initiative to expand our project from kind of import of their agricultural products in order to help them to relieve them from their financial problems and the debt.
Thank you very much for the very clear and open and frank replies. Obviously, these issues could be for another panel of 2 or 3 hours more to be able to debate, but it's really key. Now, you got also a couple of questions, not too long, because I think we are already too late.
Thank you very much for these excellent questions. Let me start with the second question as well. Is there any risk linking growth to inclusive growth? Our sense at the World Bank is not either or. We need to keep the focus on growth in African countries because the growth level is already extremely low and sluggish. So it is important to keep this in parallel. Again, it's not either or, it's not one before the after. We need to work in parallel, boosting growth and ensuring that growth is distributed properly across the income strata. So it is important for our countries, and just to give you a couple of numbers, we still have 40% average poverty across sub-Saharan Africa. So, we have 82% of our poor living from subsistence agriculture. We need to invest to increase productivity in agriculture, for example. We need irrigation. We need investments that would allow our people to actually feel more included in the growth process. So it is important to focus on investment in attracting capital. Yes, we need capital in Africa because the infrastructure gap is so big that we cannot think of actually getting out of poverty without addressing this. Now, the question on the financial sector. I agree with you, the financial sector plays a big role in inclusive growth. And if you think of the experience of East Asian countries that have grown extremely fast over the past 50 years, they all had a very, very developed domestic financial system that could mobilize domestic savings and turn it into long-term financing for their infrastructure and for their development. We don't have that across Africa. So it's important to actually deepen, reforms in our financial sectors. And the consequence of that is that most of our countries actually spend a lot of their revenues paying back debt service, because to finance the needed infrastructure, they need to borrow from abroad. So paying or servicing debt, therefore, prevents governments to actually conduct the kind of fiscal policy that would be more inclusive. So it's important to make sure our countries develop the type of financial systems that would allow the development to be financed more from domestic sources. But we do see an opportunity in the digital economy. In countries like Kenya, this issue of the financial system is being resolved through the digital economy. In countries like Kenya, Uganda, and now Senegal, the number of mobile money accounts exceeds the number of formal bank accounts. That's already in itself really acting in improving inclusion of the most defavorized people. So, we do see the digital as a huge opportunity for inclusion.
Thank you very much. Even if you didn't get questions, I will give the chance also for a last comment to the three other panelists, starting by Mrs. Cox, then Mr. Manali, and for Emo. Please, the last idea that you would like to share, that we take it with us.
Thank you very much. Couldn't agree more with what Mr. Zufak has just said. Yes, indeed, we need to invest. We would agree we need to make a lot of progress in many different countries. The question is how you define the policies in order to make that progress, so that the progress is shared equally between everyone. Current policies aren't doing that. That is why we need to revisit them. If we do more of the same, we'll get more of the same results. So soaring inequality. That's why, in our opinion at least, we need to be willing to revisit and rethink and to challenge ourselves about how we go about producing progress for everyone.
Thank you very much.
On my end, I sit here and I speak on behalf of many African youth. So I want to address just 3 challenges, if you'll allow me, that I feel are obstacles to actually achieving effective participation for youth in development processes. Now, the first challenge that I view as ineffective right now is the rigidity in our education system. It is not responding to the 21st century needs. According to the African Economic Outlook report, there's about 200 million youth in Africa in the 21st century. Thus, there's a high demand for job creation in order to aid our economy, which is well understood. Now, I, as an education advocate, I believe that education plays a fundamental foundation in the creation of a qualified workforce that can actually be able to contribute to dynamic economic environment. On top of this, I am highly interested in economic empowerment for the youth. But when I look at our education system currently, it does not allow youth to enjoy both quality education and also enhance their ability for their financial stability. Therefore, a system is required to create a balance between creating a conducive environment to foster quality education and also to increase their ability to build businesses which can therefore aid their economy. My recommendation on this is to be able to integrate financial literacy at all levels of education. Education is a fundamental need in all our countries. We all want our children to go to schools. But in Malawi, in impoverished communities, children are actually the breadwinners of their families. So it's either they go to school or it's either they feed their family. Children should not be given or youth rather, should not be given, should not have to choose between education and financial prosperity. So what is better is to integrate all these things, to nurture them while they're young so that they're able to not only acquire high levels of education, but be able to finance their businesses, accumulate wealth, and manage their finances as they grow and aid our economy. The second challenge I would like to address are limited financial assistance. Many youth I work with in both urban and rural communities are concerned that they don't have access to finances. And our chief economist for the World Bank here, I'm sure you elaborate more on that. But we're still struggling as youth. We're battling the issues of actually having to provide high-value assets as collateral. We're talking about land, houses, vehicles. Imagine an 18-year-old with a brilliant idea, but they cannot execute this because they live on $1 a day. How are they supposed to give out land as collateral? Just like that, a dream is killed. So I have advice in twofolds. For policymakers, ensure that youth are at the initiation process of all policy formulation. If it is for youth-led businesses, then it should include youth to be able to negotiate terms. We understand that you would like to minimize risks, be able to manage your budgets, but allow us to negotiate the terms so that we can be able to build our economy as well. And the third, to youth, if there's any youth in here, I believe that we should not be limited by our financial stability. My organization has never been donor-funded, but we still continue to do our work in our communities. I would not mind the assistance, but we still continue to do it. But for financial institutions, food for thought, our reach is limited because we don't have access to a lot of finances. The last thing that I would like to say, policies are great on paper, but there is ineffective implementation of these policies. I am passionate about good governance. I am extremely passionate about good governance, and so are many other youth. But the system is rigged against us. For example, in Kenya, for budget for budget review meetings, they're scheduled on the same day at the same time. And are requiring all citizens to participate. How do you expect a person to be available at 2 meetings at the same time? So systems such as those need to be reviewed so that there is fair representation of all groups to be able to set priorities, to be able to say what they would like from their government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry to hurry you up, but I think it's important that you went until the end of your thoughts. Now, final word for you, short, please.
Thank you very much. And to be at the end of this conversation is really hard. But I think member states in the UN did something quite transformational when they adopted the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. The Agenda 2030 is really something different from what the Millennium Development Goals were. And if you look at the priorities decided, it was putting the nations, the national priorities at the front, working with the private sector, and the UN and international society can only support. So how we can support to drive inclusive growth, sustainable growth, I think is key. And we have to find practical solutions, and how we, through infrastructure, education, digitalization, can help provide these smart solutions that allow citizens to access health services, education, jobs, all the things that matters to us as individuals, as municipalities, and as societies matters. They are key. In this situation, I think also seeing how multilateralism is challenged is important to notice, because so many of these solutions will require international cooperation. So looking for what is practical, looking for how we actually are able to mobilize these $7 trillion that are needed annually is more important than actually talking too much about what the $153 million or $1 billion for development aid can do. If we're not able to build these new partnerships, we will fail. And that is what I think the international institutions are so busy trying to find these new solutions. And thank you again for hosting this panel. I think the debate shows we have really sort of different angles to this, but all looking for ways we can contribute.
Thank you very much. It has been really very, very interesting. Obviously, time is always short because there are so many ideas that we would like to continue discussing and understanding how we can make it better. So I don't pretend to conclude, but I would just launch 2 or 3 things that I think it's a little bit of a common ground with maybe different views, different experiences, but could be useful for this cooperation, the continuation of the cooperation. I think that it's pretty clear that when we think growth, we need to be clear about what do you mean by growth, and in any case what I heard is that inclusive and sustainable go together. And behind sustainable there are all these also issues related to debt that we didn't have the time to discuss, but it's very important for the sustainability. And in thinking about sustainable and inclusive growth, I think one question that was launched during the debate is, can we continue to do things in the same way or should we do it differently? I think that most of you said differently, in different ways, but I think it's clear to me that the answer is differently. I think it's very clear that policies have a role to play and that it's very important. We cannot say like, you know, governments, they don't have much to, no, they have a lot to say, and also all the actors in the countries and in the economy. And in terms of policies, I also heard from several of you that it is very important to involve the concerned people in the definition of policies. And I think that all the institutions and experiences here have that in mind. It's easier said than done because I think it's pretty difficult. But I think you all said something about the need to involve those concerned in the definition of policies. And in order to do that, one of the elements that came up during the debate here from many angles is education or training or giving the capacity to the citizens, to the local communities to be actors in this inclusive growth. So I think that we can continue our thinking here, and for sure, from my personal point of view, international cooperation is key. Absolutely. Because otherwise we will not manage. The challenges are too big. So I think this is really very important. So thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you to the participants for very lively and interesting debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.